Okay, hi again. I want to say hello again to Andrew and to Alyson, who I see each day. They are key members of the Education Week's Government and Politics team. They are the co-bloggers on the Politics K-12 blog, and that keeps everybody informed on daily doings having to do with federal education policy every day. And this is a kind of a perfect handoff, I think, from the last discussion. I think between the two of you, you really cover the waterfront on federal policy, from the White House and the Education Department to Congress and blogging each day. So I'd really like to start out kind of picking up the ball from the last discussion to ask you, Alyson, what's next for Betsy Devos in this post-election world?
So obviously, as most people here know, Betsy DeVos came in and everybody was expecting her to push a big school choice initiative. And I think she was expecting to push a big school choice initiative. And it just really hasn't gone anywhere, even with Republicans in charge of both the House and the Senate. And obviously, after the most recent election, you know, the Republicans lost the House, the Democrats will now be in charge. So if her agenda was already pretty dead on school choice, it's like super dead now, extra dead. There's really no chance that the Democrats will go along with a private school voucher program, which is something she's pitched, a tuition tax credit scholarship program, which is something she was working on kind of behind the scenes, or even just allowing federal money to follow students to the public school of their choice. Maybe eventually Congress would do that, but it would be many years down the road. It won't be this next Congress, and it won't likely be under this secretary. She's also pitched some big budget cuts to the department, $5 billion, I believe, last year. Again, those were rebuffed by Congress. You know, she and President Trump wanted to get rid of the 21st Century Community Learning Centers program, which is the biggest program for after school. Title II, which a lot of you probably know is the biggest program for teachers. They proposed doing away with those programs. The Republican Congress said no. A Democratic Congress is going to say like hell no. So it's going to be a tough couple of years for her. And I think Andrew can talk a little bit more about how often she'll be coming to Capitol Hill on oversight issues.
But before we get to that, I was just going to ask if she's not going to make traction on these signature issues that she wanted to push, what are they going to do? I mean, what is there to the administration's education agenda then if these are basically dead-ended in a couple of different areas? So
they've gotten interested, first of all, in changing the structure of the department. I don't know. In our last panel, we heard that doesn't have a huge impact on the classroom level, but they've talked about things like getting rid of the office of the main office for English language learners. That office has a pretty small budget, but they do important research. Betsy DeVos and her team want to fold that into the larger K-12 office. They say that would help infuse English language learners and concentration on English language learners kind of throughout all K-12 programs, but many in the ELL and civil rights community are really concerned that they kind of won't have a dedicated home for their issues. So there'll be a lot of, I guess, kind of bureaucratic, that seems trivial to say rearranging of deck chairs, but it may end up being that, just kind of changing around offices. She's also spent a lot of time getting rid of Obama administration directives. She's expected to shortly probably call for getting rid of, or at least significantly changing guidance that the Obama administration had put out on discipline disparities. And she may do that as part of her school safety push. And so a lot of shrinking of the federal role, a lot of, taking down Obama guidance, and probably a lot of coming up to Capitol Hill to answer to lawmakers about especially the way that she's handled civil rights issues.
Well, this is a good handoff to Andrew, who is our primary congressional reporter. There may be more action or at least more noise in the current Congress, with the changes that are taking place there.
Yeah, so I don't know how many people in the audience think our federal lawmakers exercise a lot of foresight, but if you're a fan of oversight, particularly on the House side, you might soon be in a better mood because, as many of you probably anticipate, there will be quite a bit of that regarding Betsy DeVos, both in the Education Committee, where Bobby Scott is the incumbent chairman, and in other committees as well. As was alluded to, there will be a lot of oversight and questions that Democrats will have for DeVos about her moves on civil rights. Keep in mind that Bobby Scott is a former civil rights attorney. He's also the second African American to hold the post as chairman once he takes office. Lawmakers will also be asking her about her approach to the Every Student Succeeds Act. Lawmakers on the Democratic side for close to 2 years now have been saying that the plans that she has approved do not adequately or do not conform to the law when it comes to taking into account low-performing students and low-performing schools. I have been told that we shouldn't expect to see DeVos twice a week. So if you were looking forward to that kind of programming, you might be a little disappointed. You might see some deputies for her like Ken Marcus, who oversees the Office for Civil Rights, and Frank Brogan, who oversees elementary and secondary education. You might see folks like that in the mix called up by House Democrats to Capitol Hill. So you might not see as much of Betsy DeVos, quite as much as people might think.
You mentioned Congressman Scott. Are there other players in Congress that we ought to be watching that may kind of either rise or fall in this new environment?
Yeah, so I think obviously the first person I think many people would mention is Lamar Alexander, who will continue as the chairman of the Senate Education Committee. There are a couple of things to keep in mind about Alexander. It's not clear he's going to run again in 2020 when he's up. But even if he does, after 2020, he will be termed out, so to speak, of his chairmanship of the Education Committee. Now, for a while, it's been his priority to get a reauthorization of the Higher Education Act done. 2 years ago, that looked like the odds might be decent. Now, that effort with Patty Murray and on the House side has fallen through. Now it will be interesting to see if he can make a deal with Bobby Scott and others to reauthorize the higher education law, similar, I should point out, to what was done with the Every Student Succeeds Act, potentially in 2015. So it will be interesting to see how Alexander approaches that decision. Another lawmaker to watch just quickly is Rosa DeLauro, who is going to be the House lawmaker in charge of basically the Education Department appropriations in the subcommittee. She is very vocal and very oppositional to many Betsy DeVos initiatives. One more thing I should say about Scott is that he's not one of these lawmakers who appears a lot on CNN. He's understated, and to use a British expression, he's not fond of giving people the hair dryer. He doesn't shout, he doesn't scream, but he is very focused on civil rights in particular, as well as Essa.
You recently wrote a piece for Education Week about the most recent Congress, what they did or what they didn't do. And can you talk a little bit about that and what kind of unfinished business is there out there?
Yeah, if you want some light reading, you can check out that piece. They didn't get a great deal done. Probably their signature accomplishment in terms of passing a law, as people understand it, was a reauthorization of the Perkins Career and Technical Education Law, which Trump signed into law over the summer. It was something the Trump administration wanted. It was something that the business community wanted. It was overdue for reauthorization by about 10 years. And so once it got momentum behind it, it passed relatively quickly and relatively easily. One thing we noted at the start of Trump's term was that Congress got rid of Obama-era regulations regarding Essa and school accountability, which Republicans like Alexander really didn't like, thought it was too restrictive, as well as Obama rules for teacher preparation. After that, the list thins out pretty quickly. They passed appropriations bills for the Education Department, although as I wrote, praising people for that is sort of like praising people for brushing their teeth. It's sort of a low bar to cross.
Well, you mentioned higher education. I was going to ask you, Alyson, the higher education bill, there's a lot of attention to higher education in the current department and in Congress. What's up with that? Why higher education, not so much K-12? Have the K-12 issues kind of fallen off the agenda?
So before this crew, the Trump crew, came in, Congress had already passed the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was a long time coming, reauthorization of No Child Left Behind, and that kind of settled a lot of K-12 issues for a while. Probably the most important thing that the Republican Congress and Secretary DeVos and President Trump did on education, they did in the first 100 days of Congress when they got rid of the Obama administration's, and this is very wonky, but it really mattered, I promise, accountability regulations for Essa. So essentially, Republicans in Congress and President Trump and Secretary Devos felt like those regulations went too far in restricting the state role, that they kind of kept a bigger federal role than there needed to be. The civil rights organizations and actually some state leaders were like, well, no, it actually gives a lot of clarity on important parts of the law, and we want these regulations to stay in place, but they got rid of them. And then once that was done, there wasn't really all that much left to do, right? Because Essa had already passed. Secretary DeVos did need to approve, and she has approved all 50 state plans. But she used, as one would expect for somebody who really believes in a smaller federal role, she used a pretty light touch on that. On the other hand, though, the Higher Education Act is still up. I think that, Bobby Scott, who we heard Andrew talk about, and Lamar Alexander may even take a go at trying to come up with some sort of a bipartisan reauthorization there. So higher ed is kind of a hotter policy in that way. And the federal Essa had a whole list of prohibitions on the secretary's role in education. And those were put in partly because Republicans and even some Democrats in Congress really felt like the Obama administration overreached. So if there's this whole section of Essa, if you're like a Washington policy nerd, it's actually really fun to read. Where it just talks about all of the things the secretary is not allowed to do, and almost every one of them is something like Arne Duncan did. Like you can look back on the calendar and be like, oh, no interfering with teacher evaluation. Arne Duncan did that in December, and you like go through. So it wouldn't have mattered really who the next president was. It could have been Hillary Clinton, and it could have been a secretary who really believed in a big federal role, and they still would have been facing this whole litany of restrictions. So you've got all the restrictions plus a secretary who doesn't believe in a big federal role in K-12, and so K-12 just hasn't been a really hot issue. Whereas higher ed, there's no list of restrictions in the Higher Education Act. There is a lot that the federal government is allowed to do on that. Student loans was actually, we didn't write about it a ton because we're a K-12 publication, but student loans were a huge issue during the Obama years. There was a lot of curbing of what for-profit colleges can do through a very wonky regulation known as gainful employment. And now, just like the Trump administration is undoing much of the Obama administration's civil rights guidance, they're undoing many of those things on higher ed, and that takes up a lot of energy that otherwise might be spent on K-12.
Now, I want to return to something that I mentioned earlier in the day, that we're going to do some crystal ball gazing, and we do have the title of the event is 2020 Vision. So I wanted to ask really, what's the education buzz around some of the possible presidential contenders for 2020 who may be out there kind of polishing up their resumes at this point?
So Andrew and I did a blog post a couple weeks ago where I think, how many people were in that post? Like
Close to 30.
30, okay. So we looked, and one of them was Oprah, so we cast a wide net of what various people who are thinking about maybe possibly running for president, what their views have been on education. And I guess some of the main folks to mention, just because more because their track records in education are a little interesting. One would be Cory Booker, who originally was sort of like the original pro-voucher Democrat. That was really interesting, and he worked with Facebook to get all this money for New York City schools when he was the mayor there. Then now that he's in Congress, he's suddenly, and he had actually spoken at, because he's a pro-voucher Democrat, he had spoken at Betsy Devos's, she used to run a group called, most of you probably know this, the American Federation for Children, which was a pro-voucher organization. He spoke at their conference, Cory Booker did, and then when she was nominated for Secretary of Education, he wasn't like, oh great, let's all vote for my friend Betsy. He was like, this would be terrible, she'd be a terrible Secretary of Education, because he's kind of positioning himself to run in 2020. So that's one to watch. Andrew, what do you think, who else would be?
Well, I think that a lot of you are familiar with the names. I would say one thing to keep in mind, especially on the Democratic side, is that it's going to be really interesting to see how the candidates approach the unions, especially after this year of educator activism and all the attention that was given by we in the media and other people to teachers engaging with politics. And so I think there is going to be quite a lot of effort put in by candidates as they get more serious to establishing links with the NEA and AFT. And in turn, the NEA and AFT are going to have sort of things to navigate in terms of who do we endorse, when do we endorse, because as Alyson can talk about, Their endorsement process when it came to 2008, for example, in 2016, not the smoothest process for them. So
in 2008, NEA did not endorse any candidate in the primary. They stayed neutral between, at the time, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. And then Barack Obama got the nomination without any help from them. And then for the next 8 years, he proceeded to pass a bunch of policies and enact a bunch of policies that they did not like teacher evaluation through test scores, really big expansions of charter schools. So they made a really early endorsement of Hillary Clinton in 2016, hoping that she would really be tied to them, she would owe the nomination to them. But that backfired because a lot of their supporters actually really wanted them to endorse Bernie Sanders and got really mad at them. So it'll be interesting to see how they play at this time with such a big field. What I'm actually really curious about is if you look at many of the issues that Democrats ran on in 2018, who are running for governor or state chief or Senate, they really weren't talking about a lot of the things that we've been talking about up here, like testing and accountability and school turnarounds. Like, they really weren't talking about that. They were talking about things like career and technical education, education funding, expanding pre-kindergarten, social and emotional learning and the importance of that. So that's really where the focus has shifted. And I wonder if we're gonna see sort of 30 different education platforms that all look the same, or if somebody will try to differentiate themselves by, for instance, deciding that it would be a good idea to back off of annual testing, which would be a really, I guess, provocative, interesting move to make. Might make the teachers' unions really happy. It would make the civil rights groups a lot less happy.
So to what extent has really kind of the action shifted to the state level? Can we see some of that with the new governors who are coming in? And I know that we heard from the NGA person a little bit earlier today, and from Maria, talking about new governor names as folks who may be throwing their hat in the ring at a certain point.
Yeah, I think that thanks to Essa and also to a department that doesn't believe in a very strong federal role, a lot of the action has shifted to the states. And there are definitely some really interesting governors to watch who were elected in 2018. Obviously, one of them is Tony Evers, who just barely won in Wisconsin, being able to unseat Scott Walker. Tony Evers was previously the state schools chief. Wisconsin is one of the states that has a voucher program. Tony Evers is not a fan of vouchers. He wants to see big increases to education funding. He's going to have to deal with a Republican legislature. So he's an interesting governor to watch. Another one would be Laura Kelly in Kansas. She won basically running on increasing education funding in one of the reddest states in the country, which is also really, Kansas has really starved K-12 schools for quite a while, and there's a lawsuit going on, and she wants to see that funding increased. Be interesting to see if she's able to do that with a Republican legislature. And then the new governor of Colorado is a gentleman named Jared Polis, who many of you in Washington probably know. He was one of the biggest charter school supporters among Democrats in Congress. So it'll be interesting to see how he takes that sort of education reform perspective and brings it to the governor's mansion in Colorado.
Andrew, I wanted to pick up on something that you mentioned a little bit earlier, talking about the teachers' unions as trying to find their role, their pressure points here. If you and Alyson can maybe just talk a little bit about where are the kind of the traditional advocacy groups, civil rights groups, or various different advocacy groups, where are they likely to be putting their pressure in the next 2 years? Because we know whether we've had a lineup of a discussion having to do with what the Trump administration may be having in the way of unfinished business and in Congress. Do you have a sense yet of what other interest groups really are going to be putting their energies into?
I think it'll be a mix, like at lots of other different points. I mean, I think it would be a mistake to say that there won't be a lot of attention on Washington, because every time the Democrats in the House get Betsy Devos in public testifying, there are going to be all different kinds of groups trying to get their questions asked through members of Congress on that committee. So there's going to be a lot of attention on that. And as many of you know, Betsy Devos has made news up on the Hill in ways that she often did not intend, that Democrats are very happy about, which maybe they'll try and fold into 2020 messaging when the time comes. I don't know. So there will be a lot of pressure on that. But We write about Essa a lot, and I think that, I think there will be continuing pressure by civil rights advocacy groups, in particular at the state level, to ensure that, states are not slipping up when it comes to underperforming schools and disadvantaged students. Alyson, I don't know if I stole your thunder there.
No, that's pretty. I think that was a good answer. I do think there's not a lot of, like, during the Obama years, we saw a lot of friction between civil rights groups and teachers unions on areas like testing and, even to some extent some civil rights enforcement. I don't think that, like, now they all are united in their hatred of Trump and Betsy DeVos. So I don't think they're like that. A lot of that friction that we saw during the Obama years has been put on hold.
Interesting. We have some time for questions from the audience. If folks have questions for our political team here, I would like to mention at this point also that we had hoped to have Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici here for this event today. She had RSVP'd. She was to be here because of leadership votes that are taking place today on Capitol Hill. She's not able to be with us. It's just impossible while the leadership votes are taking place. The same is also true for Congresswoman-elect Jahana Hayes, who you saw a video of a little bit earlier today. She was to have been here in person, but because of the leadership votes that are happening, she was not able to be there. I really would encourage everybody to tune into edweek.org. Our reporter, Madeline Will, had an exclusive sit-down interview with Jahana Hayes 2 days ago. A very interesting 30-minute session, and we will be posting that on edweek.org, so you'll be able to hear her expand on her policy positions and her thoughts about going forward. And we're open for any questions. Really appreciate this.
Well, I wanted to say thank you very much for joining all of us. If we have no questions, we're going to close the day here. I want to thank Alyson, Andrew, and Mark, if we could, for their insights and their expertise today.